June 18th, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas. The smell reached us before anything else. It drifted through the camp slowly, almost politely, as if it were unsure it belonged there. Warm, salty, faintly sweet. It moved past the wooden barracks, slipped through the narrow gaps in the barbed wire, and settled in the air above the gravel yard where we stood in line. I remember thinking, very clearly, that it was the wrong smell for this place. Prisons, as I understood them, were supposed to smell like sweat, disinfectant, wet wood, and fear. They were supposed to smell thin, empty. This smell was none of those things. It was thick. It had weight. It reminded the body that it had once known comfort. The fence beside us trembled slightly in the Texas heat, metal expanding under the sun. Somewhere nearby, cicadas buzzed in long, lazy pulses. Boots crunched on gravel. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. And yet my attention kept drifting back to that smell, as if it were calling me by name. A metal cart rolled across the yard, its wheels complaining with every turn. Not the sharp rattle of chains, not the clatter of tools. This was a domestic sound, familiar in a way I could not immediately place. The cart slowed near the mess hall doors, and the smell deepened. Sausage. Not the thin, gray substitute we had known in the last years of the war. This was different. This smelled of meat that had not been stretched, of fat that had not been apologized for. It carried a faint trace of bread, soft bread, and something sharp and tangy that made my mouth water before I could stop it. That smell didn't belong in a prison. The thought came to me fully formed, almost offended by its own certainty. I was standing in Texas, thousands of miles from home, wearing a faded uniform marked with a small white PW. I was a German prisoner of war, and yet the air around me smelled like a county fair. The cart stopped. Someone laughed, an American laugh, loose and unguarded. The sound landed strangely in the yard, too relaxed, as if no one had told him where he was. I caught a glimpse of white paper napkins stacked neatly beside the cart. Clean. Square. Useless things, I thought. No one wastes paper like that in a war. Behind the mess hall, the screen door creaked open and shut. I could hear the hiss of something hot meeting metal, the unmistakable sound of food being cooked without urgency. In 1944, the world was burning. We knew that, even here. News traveled through whispers, through guarded radio announcements, through letters that arrived already stripped of their sharpest truths. In Europe, cities were rubble, fields were cratered. In Germany, my mother boiled potatoes until they collapsed into themselves, if she could get potatoes at all. Meat was a memory you learned not to trust. But in America, the war sounded different. Even as prisoners, we heard things. Numbers that felt unreal. Factories that did not sleep. Somewhere in Michigan, at a place called Willow Run, bombers rolled off an assembly line so quickly that men joked a new one took flight every 63 minutes, an hour. Less time than it took us to stand through roll call. Here in Texas, cattle grazed beyond the horizon. Millions of them, someone whispered once, shaking his head as if the number were an insult. Entire landscapes devoted not to survival, but to abundance. I tried not to think about those things. Thinking made hunger louder. The smell grew stronger. Hot dogs, I would later learn they were called. At that moment, I only knew that they reminded me of places that did not exist anymore. Summer gatherings, baseball games, gas stations along long roads where people stopped because they wanted to, not because they had to. I had never seen a baseball game, but I had heard of them. Even in Germany, America was imagined through fragments, films, posters, laughing crowds eating things on sticks. The idea had always felt exaggerated, childish even. No country could live like that while the world was starving. And yet the smell did not lie. The line moved forward. No one spoke. He watched the Americans behind the serving table. They wore the same uniforms as the guards outside, but their faces were softer here, distracted by routine. One of them wiped his hands on a towel slung over his shoulder. Another leaned back against the counter, sipping from a chipped enamel mug. This was not a performance. The hot dogs lay nestled in pale buns, their ends slightly split from the heat. Steam rose lazily, unconcerned with ideology. A bottle of mustard stood open nearby, its yellow cap streaked from use. Someone had placed a stack of napkins close enough to reach without asking. It occurred to me then that this meal had not been prepared for us. It had simply been prepared. That realization unsettled me more than hunger ever had. Hunger was familiar. It had rules. This did not. I thought of Germany in 1944, of ration cards carefully folded, of queues that ended before supplies did, of my father once cutting a sausage into slices so thin you could see the plate through them. We called that discipline, sacrifice, strength. Here, strength smelled like bread and meat and heat. The cart creaked again as it was nudged into position. The sound echoed softly off the wooden walls of the mess hall, a place that looked more like a school cafeteria than a prison dining room. Long tables, benches worn smooth by use, sunlight slanting through screened windows. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear, not yet, but a kind of disorientation I did not have a name for. If this was a prison, what did freedom look like? No one answered that question. The line moved, the smell stayed. And somewhere, deep beneath my ribs, something I had buried since capture began to stir, an understanding that whatever awaited us in America would not follow the rules we had been taught. The war, I realized, might not end with guns. Sometimes it began with a hot dog. The line kept moving, and that was when the fear arrived. Not all at once, not loudly. It came the way propaganda always does, quiet, practiced, patient. It rose up from places hunger had not managed to reach. As I stepped forward, the smell still heavy in the air, a voice inside me said, "Don't touch it." I did not know whose voice it was at first. Then I recognized it. It sounded like the radio. In Germany, before everything collapsed, the radio was always on. It spoke while we dressed, while we ate, while we tried to sleep. It spoke with confidence, with certainty, with a tone that left no room for questions. And it had been very clear about America. Americans torture prisoners. Americans starve captives for sport. Americans are crude, undisciplined, and cruel. I had heard those sentences so many times they no longer felt like warnings. They felt like facts. They were delivered alongside weather reports and marching music, woven into daily life until fear became background noise. The posters had done the rest. I remembered them suddenly, sharply. American soldiers drawn with exaggerated faces, thick lips pulled back in grins that showed too many teeth, hands like claws, eyes without conscience. The message was always the same. Surrender meant degradation. Survival meant resistance. Standing there in Texas, watching steam rise from bread that looked impossibly white, I felt those images press against the inside of my skull. "This is how it begins," the voice said. "They soften you first." I stopped at the edge of the serving table. The man behind it did not look like a monster. He looked tired, sunburned, ordinary. He placed a hot dog onto my tray with a motion so practiced it barely registered. His hands were clean, his nails trimmed. No rings, no urgency. Beside the hot dog, a soft bun rested open, yielding slightly under its own weight. I could see where the bread had been sliced, cleanly, carefully. I pressed my thumb into it without thinking. It gave way. The bread sank beneath my skin and then slowly returned to shape, like a pillow remembering itself. My stomach clenched. Not from hunger this time, but from confusion so sharp it bordered on pain. In Germany, bread did not do that anymore. Bread was gray, heavy, damp. It tore instead of bending. Sometimes it smelled faintly of mold, and sometimes you pretended not to notice because noticing changed nothing. We ate it slowly, counting bites, saving corners for later. Bread had become something you endured. This was not that bread. I pulled my hand back as if I had touched something dangerous. Behind me, I could feel the tension in the line. No one spoke, but I knew what they were thinking, because I was thinking it too. If this food was real, then everything we had been told was wrong. And if everything was wrong, then what else had been built on lies? The Americans did not rush us. No one barked orders. No one watched closely. That made it worse. I carried my tray to the table and sat down slowly, as if sudden movement might trigger something hidden. Around me, women did the same. We placed our trays down and stared at them, a row of untouched meals cooling in the open air. No one ate. The Americans took their own trays and sat at a nearby table. They ate casually, leaning back, talking about something that made one of them laugh. The sound was low and familiar, the kind of laughter that came from shared routines. They ate the same food, the same buns, the same sausages, the same mustard, squeezed in uneven lines across the meat. One of them reached for a stack of white napkins and took two without counting. White napkins. In Germany, paper had become precious. We tore old newspapers into squares and folded them carefully. Even that was a luxury some days. Here, napkins sat in a stack, clean and untouched, waiting to be used and discarded. I watched one of the Americans wipe his mouth and toss the napkin aside without a second thought. My appetite vanished. "This is a test," the voice insisted. "They want to see who eats." Across from me, a woman named Liesel sat rigidly, her hands folded in her lap. She had been a schoolteacher before the war. Calm, precise. Her eyes flicked once toward the door, then back to her tray. "Don't," she whispered in German, barely moving her lips. "Wait." I nodded. Waiting was something we understood. In Europe, waiting had become a way of life, waiting for bread deliveries that never arrived, waiting for letters that stopped coming, waiting for the war to end while it found new ways to continue. By 1944, Germany was starving. We knew the numbers even if we did not say them aloud. Civilians survived on 1,200 calories a day, sometimes less. Soup stretched with water. Potatoes counted carefully. Meat rationed to memories. And yet here we were, prisoners, staring at a meal that could have fed a German family for a day. 3,200 calories, someone whispered later, as if the number itself were obscene. I did not know that number then. I only knew the weight of the tray in my hands felt wrong. Too heavy, too generous. What kind of enemy feeds you like this? I imagined my mother in our kitchen, the one room of the apartment that still felt safe before the bombs came too close. She would have stared at this food as I did now, suspicious, calculating. She would have cut the sausage into pieces, saving half for tomorrow, even if tomorrow was uncertain. Here, nothing suggested tomorrow needed planning. That frightened me more than hunger ever had. An American soldier passed behind our table. I tensed automatically, shoulders tightening, spine straightening as it had been trained to do. He did not stop. He did not look down at us. He simply walked by, carrying his empty tray toward a bin. No one shouted. No one struck the table. No one demanded we eat or starve. The absence of pressure felt like a trap all its own. Why are they not watching? Why are they not angry? I picked up the napkin and turned it over in my hands. It was thick, soft. It did not tear when I pressed my fingers into it. It smelled faintly of nothing at all. Across the table, another woman lifted her hot dog slightly as if testing its weight. Her hands trembled. She set it back down quickly as if afraid it might accuse her. The radio voice returned louder now. "Americans humiliate prisoners. They take pleasure in breaking you." But nothing in front of me matched that story. Instead, there was mustard in a glass bottle labeled Heinz, the name printed cleanly, confidently, as if it had never known scarcity. I twisted the cap once, then stopped. My heart was beating too fast. If this kindness was real, then it meant we had been afraid of the wrong thing. And that was a terrifying thought. Fear, I understood. Fear had rules. Fear kept you alive, but doubt unraveled everything. Doubt asked questions you were not prepared to answer. I stared at the hot dog until the steam faded. I told myself it was safer to go hungry for another hour than to accept something that might change me. Around us, the Americans finished their meals and stood up. One of them nodded absently in our direction. Not at us, just through us, as if we were part of the furniture, and carried his tray away. They did not care whether we ate. That realization landed slowly, heavily. If they did not care, then the meal was not a performance. It was policy, routine, procedure, and if this was routine, then fear had been my most faithful companion for years, and it had been lying to me. My hand hovered over the bread again, close enough to feel its warmth. I pulled it back. Not yet. I was not ready to find out how long I had been afraid of a story that was no longer true. The fear did not disappear when the food stayed. It lingered, coiled tight beneath my ribs as the minutes passed and nothing happened. No whistles, no shouted commands, no sudden punishment for our hesitation. The hot dogs cooled on our trays and still the world refused to correct itself. That was when I noticed something worse than cruelty. No one was watching us. I had been trained to feel eyes even when none were visible. In Germany, authority was everywhere, behind walls, inside radios, embedded in silence. You learned to eat carefully, to speak quietly, to assume that someone, somewhere, was keeping score. Here, there was no score. An American soldier stood near the serving table, arms relaxed at his sides. He was young, maybe not much older than I was, with dust on his boots and sweat darkening the collar of his uniform. His rifle hung loose on its strap, forgotten. He looked at us, not sharply, not with suspicion, but with something like mild concern, the way a person looks at a stalled car on the side of the road. "You're allowed," he said. That was all. 2 words. No explanation. No warning. No demand for gratitude. He did not even raise his voice. He said it as if reminding us of something obvious, something we had temporarily forgotten. "You're allowed." The words struck harder than any order ever had. Allowed to what? To eat? To breathe? To exist without permission? He did not clarify, and perhaps that was the point. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then turned away. He turned his back on us. In Germany, turning your back on prisoners would have been unthinkable. Control required attention. Discipline required presence. Here, the absence of scrutiny felt deliberate. My hands shook as I picked up the hot dog. The bread was warm against my palms. The metal tray beneath it reflected the pale Texas light, scratched and dulled by use. I noticed then how ordinary everything was. This was not a special setup. The trays were worn, the tables were scarred with old marks and initials carved by bored hands. This place had a history, and it was not centered on us. I took a bite, small at first, almost apologetic. The casing snapped softly beneath my teeth. Heat spread across my tongue, followed by salt and fat and something deeper, satisfaction perhaps, or the memory of it. No one reacted, no alarms, no laughter, no punishment. I took another bite, larger this time. Across from me, Liesel watched my face closely as if waiting for a sign. When nothing happened, she reached for her own bread. She hesitated, then pressed it gently between her fingers, feeling it yield and return. Her eyes filled with something that looked like relief but was not yet allowed to become emotion. The American soldier did not turn back. Instead, another one approached the table. Older, this one, with lines at the corners of his eyes and a patch on his sleeve worn thin. He carried a basket under one arm. Without speaking, he set it down near us and adjusted it so it would not tip. More bread. He did not ask how many we needed. He did not make eye contact. He simply placed the basket within reach and walked away, already focused on something else. I stared at the bread. In Germany, bread was counted. Here, it was replenished. This was not generosity as performance. It was logistics. Routine. The quiet confidence of a system that assumed there would always be enough. I ate slowly, forcing myself to chew properly, afraid that if I rushed, the moment would collapse. Mustard stained my fingers, bright yellow against my skin. I wiped them with a white napkin, marveling again at its thickness, the way it absorbed grease without tearing. At the next table, the Americans talked among themselves. A radio sat on a shelf near the wall, its volume low but steady. A familiar melody drifted through the room. Glenn Miller, I would learn later. Swing music, light and insistent, utterly unconcerned with the war that consumed half the world. The sound wrapped around us, domestic and calm. One of the Americans tapped his foot in time, another hummed under his breath. They were not trying to impress us. They were not trying to teach us anything. They were simply eating lunch. It occurred to me then that this kindness was not personal. That was the most unsettling part. They did not need to believe we were good people. They did not need to forgive us. Their treatment of us was not dependent on our repentance or obedience. It was policy, structure, the quiet application of rules decided long before we arrived. I would later hear the words Geneva Convention spoken aloud, explained through an interpreter in clipped, careful sentences. I would learn that America believed feeding prisoners well made them less likely to resist, more likely to surrender, easier to send home when the war ended. But sitting there, mustard on my fingers and warmth in my stomach, I did not think about strategy. I thought about dignity. The Americans finished eating and began to clear the tables. Trays clanged softly as they were stacked. Napkins were thrown away without ceremony. The older soldier returned, this time carrying a pitcher of water. He filled our cups, one by one, without comment, and moved on. When I looked up, he was already gone. No one asked our names. No one demanded thanks. The kindness lay not in what was given, but in what was withheld. Humiliation, suspicion, spectacle. I realized then that I had spent years believing humanity had to be earned. Here, it was assumed. As I ate, the fear loosened its grip, not because it had been disproven, but because it had been ignored into irrelevance. The Americans did not argue with our expectations. They simply lived as if those expectations did not matter. And somehow, that mattered more. I finished the last bite slowly, feeling the weight of the meal settle in my body, grounding me in a way hunger never allowed. Around me, women exhaled, shoulders lowering, movements growing less rigid. No one celebrated. No one cried. We simply ate. When I stood to return my tray, I caught a glimpse of myself reflected faintly in the scratched metal. For the first time since capture, I did not look like a prisoner waiting to be corrected. I looked like a person who had been allowed to eat in peace. No one watched me leave the table. And in that small, unremarkable absence, something inside me shifted, quietly, permanently. I had crossed an invisible line, not from hunger to fullness, but from fear into something dangerously close to trust. I thought the worst of it was over once I started eating. I was wrong. The first bite had loosened something inside me, but it was the second that broke it open. I lifted the hot dog again, more confidently this time, my fingers no longer trembling as badly. The bread was still warm. Steam curled upward in thin threads, disappearing before it reached my face. I brought it to my mouth and bit down, harder than before. And just like that, the war ended inside me. Not the war outside. The one, with maps and borders and uniforms, but the quieter one that had lived beneath my skin for years. The one that had taught me to measure every pleasure, to distrust anything that felt good, to brace myself even in moments of rest. The taste hit all at once, salt, fat, heat, a richness my body recognized before my mind could intervene. My jaw kept moving even after the bite was gone, as if afraid the sensation might disappear if I stopped. My hands began to shake. At first I thought it was hunger catching up to me. the way it sometimes did when food finally arrived after a long wait. But this was different. This was not desperation. This was memory. I was no longer in Texas. I was standing in a small town square somewhere in Germany, years before the war, before uniforms replaced dresses and radios replaced conversation. There were strings of paper flags overhead and the sound of laughter that did not feel borrowed. A brass band played badly near the fountain and no one minded. I could see my mother clearly. She stood beside me, her hand wrapped around mine, warm and steady. I remembered the exact pressure of her fingers, the way she squeezed once when she wanted my attention. She smelled faintly of soap and flour. She always did when she was happy. A vendor handed her something wrapped in paper. She passed it to me without ceremony, already distracted by someone calling her name. I took a bite too fast and burned my tongue. I remember laughing and crying at the same time, startled by the heat, embarrassed by the tears. My mother knelt in front of me immediately. She did not scold. She did not rush. She blew gently on the food and then on my fingers, her face so close to mine that I could see the tiny lines at the corners of her eyes. "Slowly," she said. "Good things don't leave if you take your time." The memory hit me with such force that my breath caught. I was back at the table in Camp Hearn, staring down at my tray, tears blurring the edges of everything. My shoulders began to shake, small at first, then harder, as if my body were trying to expel something it had carried too long. I pressed my lips together, determined not to make a sound. Around me, the mess hall continued its quiet rhythm. Chairs scraped softly. Trays clanged. Someone laughed at a joke I could not hear. The radio played on, unbothered. No one looked at me. That was when the tears came in earnest. They spilled without warning, hot and unrestrained, sliding down my face and dripping onto the metal tray. I wiped them away with the back of my hand, then with a napkin, then gave up entirely. My chest ached as if something inside it had cracked. This was not the sobbing of starvation. I had seen that. I had lived that. Hunger cries out loudly, angrily. This was quieter, deeper. This was grief recognizing relief and not knowing what to do with it. Across the table, Liesel had stopped eating. Her hot dog lay untouched in front of her, cooling. She stared at it with wide eyes, her mouth slightly open as if she were afraid to move. "This can't be real food," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but the words landed like a confession. To my left, another woman had bent forward, her forehead resting on the table, her arms folded beneath her head. Her shoulders rose and fell in uneven breaths. She did not try to hide it. She did not have the strength. No one intervened. No guards rushed over. No commands were issued. No one told us to compose ourselves or be grateful or behave. The Americans did not look. They knew we were breaking, and they chose to grant us privacy. That, more than anything, undid me. For years, emotion had been dangerous. Tears were weakness. Memory was indulgence. You survived by hardening yourself, by making everything smaller so it could not hurt you. Here, softness was not punished. I took another bite, slower this time, just as my mother had taught me. I let the food rest on my tongue. I breathed through the tears, through the ache in my chest. Outside these walls, the world was still at war. I knew that. We all did. American soldiers were fighting in France, pushing inland from beaches whose names had become legends even before the blood dried. Others were dying in the Pacific, island by island, in a conflict so brutal it rarely reached our ears in detail. America was fighting on two fronts, pouring men and machines and food into a struggle that spanned the globe. And yet, here, in a wooden mess hall in Texas, they had chosen not to strip us of our humanity. They could have fed us less. They could have made us wait. They could have reminded us at every turn that we were the enemy. They did none of those things. I realized then that this was not mercy born of weakness. This was confidence. Only a country certain of its strength could afford to be this unafraid of kindness. Only a people who believed they would win could imagine a future where former enemies would have to live together again. My tears slowed. My breathing steadied. I looked down at my hands. They were stained with mustard, the bright yellow stark against my skin. I did not wipe it away immediately. It felt like proof that this moment had happened, that it was not something I had invented to survive another day. When I finally stood, my legs felt unsteady, as if I had walked a great distance without moving. I carried my tray to the return station, careful not to spill anything, careful as if the weight of the moment might shatter if I moved too quickly. As I turned away, I saw my reflection again in the dull metal surface of the counter. My eyes were red, my face streaked, but beneath that there was something else. Relief. Not relief that I had eaten, but relief that I had been allowed to feel. I had been taught that war required the destruction of the enemy. No one had told me that sometimes it ended with a meal. As I stepped back into the sunlight, the Texas heat pressed down on me, familiar now, almost comforting. The fence still stood. The guards still watched the perimeter. The war was not over, but something inside me was. I wiped my face one last time and took a breath that felt deeper than any I had taken in years. The war had not ended because I was full. It had ended because, for the first time since my capture, I had been treated not as a symbol, not as a threat, not as a defeated thing, but as a human being who was allowed to eat, to remember, and to cry in peace. That night, sleep did not come. The camp settled into its usual quiet after dusk, the soft shuffle of boots during evening checks, the distant hum of insects rising and falling with the Texas heat. But my mind would not follow the rhythm. My body was tired in a way that felt earned, yet my thoughts refused to slow. I kept seeing the bread give way beneath my fingers. I kept hearing the absence of voices telling me what to feel. When the lights dimmed, I reached beneath my mattress and pulled out the small notebook I had carried since capture. Its pages were thin, already crowded with cramped handwriting, careful not to waste space. I had written in it before. Dates, names, fragments of memory I was afraid to lose, but never like this. I hesitated, pencil hovering. For years, writing had meant record-keeping. Orders received. Locations passed through. Losses counted. Writing was discipline made visible. Tonight, it became something else. June 18th, 1944, I wrote. Camp Hearn, Texas. The words felt heavier than usual, as if they carried a meaning I had not yet uncovered. I wrote about the meal, about the smell, about the way no one watched us eat. I wrote about the soldier who said you're allowed, and then turned away as if permission did not require supervision. As I wrote, a thought formed slowly, reluctantly, like something dangerous testing the air. If America feeds prisoners like this, they were never afraid of us. I stopped writing. The sentence frightened me more than anything I had felt all day. In Germany, power had always announced itself loudly. It demanded attention, obedience, sacrifice. Discipline was enforced through fear, and fear was praised as strength. We were told that cruelty was necessary, that hardness was survival. Order came from above, and it came with punishment attached. Here, I was beginning to understand, order came from something else. The camp ran with precision. Roll calls were on time. Work details were assigned efficiently. Rules were enforced, but without spectacle. No one needed to shout to be obeyed. The Americans did not confuse chaos with freedom. Their system was not soft. It was structured, deliberate, confident, and it did not require hatred to function. That realization unsettled me deeply. I thought of the men and women who guarded us. They were not extraordinary. They were farmers' sons, factory workers, clerks. Some spoke with accents I could not place. Others whistled while they worked. This was the generation fighting the war for America. Later, I would hear them called the greatest generation, though they never used that name for themselves. They did not speak of destiny or sacrifice in grand terms. They spoke of getting the job done, of sending money home, of what they would do when the war was over. They did not need to prove their righteousness. It was assumed. I thought of Germany again, of how often we had been told that the enemy was weak, decadent, incapable of discipline. And yet, here I was, living inside a system that functioned smoothly while allowing space for dignity. We had been taught that kindness was weakness. America was showing me that kindness could be policy. Outside the barracks, someone coughed. A door closed softly. Life went on, unremarkable and steady. I wrote more. I wrote about the difference between fear and respect, about how fear demanded constant reinforcement while respect seemed to sustain itself. I wrote about how no one had asked me to be grateful, and how that made gratitude unavoidable. The pencil moved faster now, as if the words had been waiting. In Germany, we believed victory required humiliation of the defeated. We believed that to win, you had to erase the other side. Here, I began to see a different calculation. America did not need us to feel small to feel strong. They were not preparing us for execution. They were preparing us for return. For a world after the war, where memory would matter as much as territory. That was when I understood the true imbalance between us. Germany had fought with willpower and fear, convinced that belief alone could replace resources, compassion, patience. America fought with factories and farms, with systems that could afford to be humane because they were not fragile. They could feed prisoners because they could feed everyone. They could treat enemies like people because they believed in a future where those enemies would no longer be enemies. This was not mercy as charity. It was mercy as strategy, and it was devastating. I set the notebook down and leaned back on my bunk, staring at the ceiling beams. They were rough-hewn, imperfect, practical, nothing ornamental, everything functional. Somewhere across the ocean, my country was still telling itself stories about strength and honor while cities burned and children learned to sleep through air raids. Here, strength looked like restraint. For the first time, I felt the war's outcome not as a rumor, not as a fear, but as a certainty that settled calmly in my chest. They had already won, not because their guns were louder or their armies larger, though they were, but because they had not surrendered their values in order to fight. Victory did not require hatred if you were confident you would prevail. I realized then that the Americans feeding us were not trying to convince us of anything. They did not need our conversion. The proof was in the routine. I closed the notebook and slid it back beneath the mattress. My hands no longer trembled. As I lay down, the thought returned. Clearer now, stripped of fear. They won before the guns fell silent. They won when they chose to treat us as temporary enemies rather than permanent monsters. They won when they believed that how a war is fought determines what comes after it. Sleep came slowly, but it came without the sharp edge of dread that had accompanied it for months. My dreams were quieter. There were no sirens, no shouted commands, just the image of a table, a meal, and hands allowed to rest. In the morning, the war would still be there. The fences would still stand. The uniforms would still mark us as prisoners. But something essential had shifted. I no longer believed that power required cruelty. And once that belief was gone, everything else, the propaganda, the fear, the certainty, began to collapse under its own weight. America had not defeated me. It had shown me a different way to win. The question did not come to me immediately. It arrived days later, quietly, while I was standing in line for morning roll call, the Texas sun already pressing down on the yard. The fence cast its familiar shadow across the gravel. A guard adjusted his cap. Someone coughed behind me. Nothing was different. And yet everything was. What kind of America was this? The thought slipped into my mind without warning, uninvited but impossible to dismiss. I had stopped asking what America was doing and begun asking what America was. That change felt dangerous. I watched the guards move through their routines. They were efficient, unhurried, already thinking about what came next. One of them folded a letter and slid it into his pocket before the whistle blew. Another rubbed his eyes, still half asleep, and accepted a cup of coffee from a fellow soldier with a nod. They were young, ordinary, men who would one day go home. I began to imagine that home. Not the caricature we'd been shown in posters and broadcasts, but the version hinted at through small details. The way food was prepared without ceremony, the way kindness was offered without comment, the way order existed without fear attached to it. I imagined factories first. I had seen them from the train windows when we were brought inland, vast buildings stretching farther than anything in Europe, windows glowing late into the night. I pictured men and women working side by side, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, machines pounding rhythm into steel. I imagined a place where bombers were built not in desperation, but in confidence, where output was measured not in slogans, but in numbers so large they no longer needed exaggeration. Then I imagined the end of the shift, lunch pails closed, whistles blown, hands washed clean of grease, people stepping out into the evening light, tired but not afraid, families waiting, supper already planned. I imagined kitchens, tables crowded with plates, bread passed freely, children complaining about homework while adults pretended not to listen, radios playing softly in the background, not propaganda, not commands, just music filling space because silence did not need to be feared. I imagined Sundays. That image surprised me most. In Germany, Sunday had become hollow by the later years of the war. Church bells rang over half-empty streets. Meals were thin. Conversation avoided anything real. Even rest felt supervised. But when the Americans spoke of Sunday, it sounded different. A day not for endurance, but for pause. For baseball games and long dinners and drives taken simply because the weather was good. Kindness were not opposites. An America that trusted its future enough to treat enemies humanely. An America that assumed unity could survive disagreement, that compassion could coexist with power. If such an America existed once, then it could exist again. And if it no longer does, then perhaps the most important battles were never fought overseas at all. I closed my eyes, the sounds of the camp settling around me, and held on to that thought, not as accusation, not as judgment, but as an invitation. Remember this version of yourselves. Because we did. And for some of us, it changed everything. The war did not end for us with an announcement. There was no single morning when the fences disappeared or the guards laid down their rifles. The end came gradually, in pieces. Rumors carried on the wind, dates circled quietly on calendars, names read aloud and then packed away. But long before any of that, I knew what I would carry with me when this place was gone. It was not the fence. It was not the uniform. It was not even the hunger. It was the memory of how I had been treated when the war still demanded reasons to hate. I began to think about who would tell this story after me. Time has a way of erasing the ordinary things first. Battles survive, numbers survive, speeches survive, but meals disappear. Small choices vanish unless someone insists on remembering them. I imagined myself years later, older, sitting at a table that did not belong to an army. A table surrounded by children who asked questions the way children always do. Direct, impatient, unaware of how fragile answers can be. What was it like? They would ask. And I knew what they would mean. They would not be asking about the marches or the uniforms or the days when survival was counted in hours. They would be asking whether the world had been as cruel as the stories made it sound. Whether people had been monsters. Whether mercy had existed at all. I thought of what I would tell them. I would not begin with the war. I would begin with a meal. I would tell them about June 18th, 1944. About a place called Camp Hearn, Texas, about the smell that arrived before anything else, and how it did not belong in a prison. I would tell them that I was afraid even after the food was placed in front of me. Afraid because fear lasts longer than hunger. Afraid because lies, repeated often enough, begin to feel like memory. And then I would tell them what happened next. I would say, they let us eat in peace, no speeches, no humiliation, no conditions, just food, warmth, and the dignity of being left alone with our emotions. I would tell them that I survived not because I was strong, but because someone else chose not to be cruel. Tell them, I would say, if anyone ever asked me what mattered most, tell them I survived because America chose mercy. Not because they had to, because they could. I would want American children to hear this too, not as praise meant to flatter, but as inheritance meant to be carried. I would want them to know that their country once fought the largest war in human history and still believed that restraint was not weakness, that generosity was not waste, that dignity did not belong only to the victorious. I would want them to know that their grandparents' generation understood something fragile and rare, that how you treat the powerless says more about you than how you defeat the powerful. This is not a story about perfect people. The guards were not saints. The system was not flawless. Pain existed on all sides, and loss did not vanish because kindness appeared. This is not a story meant to glorify war. War remains what it has always been, destruction disguised as necessity. This is a story about what remained human inside it, about men and women who refused to let conflict erase their values, about a nation confident enough to believe that today's enemy would someday return home and remember how they had been treated. Because memory travels farther than armies ever do. When I think of America now, I do not think first of weapons or flags or victory parades. I think of a mess hall, of metal trays worn smooth by use, of white napkins stacked without counting, of a soldier peaceful Sunday. I wondered what it did to a nation, to grow up with days like that as an expectation rather than a memory. I wondered what it did to a people, to fight a war without forgetting what peace was supposed to feel like. The more I thought about it, the more the comparison pressed in. Germany had demanded unity through fear, dissent crushed, question silenced, loyalty measured by obedience. America seemed to demand unity through participation. You showed up, you did your part, and when the work was done, you were allowed to rest. No one needed to scream for cohesion when everyone believed they belonged. I began to ask myself questions I had never dared to consider before. Was America always like this? Was this generosity a product of war, or something older, deeper, already there? And then the question turned outward, away from me, toward anyone who might be listening. Is it still like this? I thought of the men guarding us. Someday they would return to those factories, those kitchens, those Sundays. They would tell stories about the war, about Europe, about prisoners who spoke with accents and learned to eat hot dogs slowly. Would they remember us as enemies? Or as proof that some wars end not with vengeance, but with restraint? I imagined their children, born after the war, growing up in houses built during years of confidence rather than scarcity. I imagined them learning history from textbooks that spoke of victory and sacrifice, of battles won and losses endured. Would they know about the mess hall in Camp Hearn? Would they know that their father's country had chosen, deliberately, to treat captured enemies with dignity? Or would that detail be lost, crowded out by louder stories? As I worked my assigned tasks, cleaning, sorting, repairing, I watched America through fragments, through the rhythm of the camp, through the consistency of meals, through the absence of cruelty where cruelty would have been easier. It struck me then that this was not a fragile kindness. Fragile kindness must be protected, defended, explained. This kindness needed none of those things. It existed because the system that produced it was strong enough to absorb it. And that made me wonder, dangerously, insistently, what had changed, if anything, since then? Would a nation still confident in itself act this way today? Would a divided country still trust restraint over rage? Would abundance still breed generosity? Or had fear crept back in through other doors? I could not answer those questions, I still cannot. But I know what I saw. I saw a country at war choose to behave as if peace were inevitable. I saw power exercised without cruelty. I saw a society confident enough to believe that today's enemy might tomorrow be someone else's neighbor. That belief haunted me more than any nightmare, because it meant that victory was not just about defeating another nation. It was about preserving yourself. One afternoon, as we returned from work detail, a guard paused to let us pass through a narrow gate. He removed his cap briefly, wiping sweat from his brow, and nodded once in greeting, not to us specifically, but to the moment. It was nothing, and yet it felt like everything. As I lay on my bunk that evening, the question returned, fuller now, heavier. What kind of America was that? An America that believed strength in who said you're allowed and then turned away, trusting that dignity did not require supervision. I think of the moment I realized that I was not being punished for losing. I was being prepared to live afterward. That is why this story matters. Not because it proves who won, but because it shows who chose not to lose themselves in the process. They didn't just defeat us, I would tell anyone willing to listen. They showed us who we could become after the war. If you are an American hearing this, know that some of us carried that lesson home across an ocean, into ruins, into rebuilding lives shaped by loss. If you are the descendant of a prisoner like me, know that survival was not only about endurance, it was about being treated as someone worth returning to the world. And if you are anyone at all, living in a time far removed from that war but still touched by its consequences, remember this. History is not only made by the loud moments, it is made by quiet choices, by meals served without spectacle, by mercy given without demand, by people who believed that victory meant more than winning. It meant preserving the kind of world worth inheriting. This is why we remember, not to reopen wounds, but to keep alive the knowledge that even in the darkest hours, someone once chose to act as if tomorrow mattered. And because of that choice, I lived. And because of that choice, perhaps others still can.